Shalom Aleichem Rabbi Say. Okay, so I think over the next few weeks we're going to try to go through the topic a little bit of the inyan slash minig slash halacha of wearing a yarmulke. We're starting now these parshias of Klal Yisrael and Galus and Kayidua, the Kemedrash, that there are specific markers that Klal Yisrael will never abandon, that Klal Yisrael will never change, Lashinos, Lashainam, Malbusham, etc. Exactly, the nuschayis of each one of the medrash, there's different versions, and maybe we'll go into that over the next few weeks. But B'chalif and Klal Yisrael has certain identifying markers that they never give up, they never change, and those are the things that help Klal Yisrael maintain its identity throughout all the various galiuses. Now, in the Chassidish Sfarim, there's a lot written about exactly what Malbush Yisrael is and what Yiddish Sprach is and Jewish names and etc. And perhaps that will be the continuation of the series. Like we'll continue down some of those side tangents over time. For example, this is always something humorous that stands out to me. In some of the Bab V'Sfarim on Chanukah, it's brought down that the Kedushas Tzion before the war had a menorah that belonged to Meir Premishlana, and on the menorah, etched in the silver, was an etching of Avram Avinu, and in the etching, Avram Avinu was wearing a spadik or a strimel with struckis on his bekisha and vice zokin, wearing like white socks like the Chassidim do. Now, how that could all be displayed in silver is your guess is as good as mine. But b'chalif, and it exists such a thing, such a Chassidish legend. Now, before I start going actually into the pratim of the minig, the chiyuv of yarmulke, when it is, when it isn't, if it's who, what, all the stories and etc., I really want to share a story, a Chassidish story, as an opener to this discussion. I think it's a very, very wichtige perspective to have as we start talking about the topic. We've mentioned it in the past, but we'll talk about it again. In the early 1800s, there was a press, a Chassidish press, the Salavita press, which was founded by a son of Rav Pinchas of Karetz and his two children, who were the grandchildren of Rav Pinchas of Karetz. Now, Rav Pinchas of Karetz was a Talmud of the Baal Shem Tov from the Talmidei Habesht, a Rebbe. He had a son, Rav Moshe of Karetz, who I do not believe was a Rebbe. Rav Moshe of Karetz, when he realized that Chassidish Sfarim couldn't get a fair shake, couldn't be printed, the Misnagdish presses were not looking to print Chassidish Sfarim, so he started a press, and the original, market of the press was to publish Chassidish Sfarim like the Mari Naim and the Naim Elimelech and Kedushas Levi, like early Chassidish Sfarim that were having a hard time getting published. But over time, the press did very well. They became very successful. And they even, at a certain point in time, had their own line of paper, I believe, that was like very high quality, their own ink that they used. They became a very successful press. Now, in the early 1800s, they were finally ready to embark on like the project of all projects. In those days, if you wanted to make some serious money or lose serious money, this was a make it or break it type of investment, was publishing a shas. A shas was something that not every household had, not even every shul had a shas. It was a tremendous undertaking to publish a shas, and the Salavita Press in 1804 decided to undertake it and to publish a shas, for the first time by a Chassidish press. Now, in order to make this investment of publishing a shas a viable investment, and this was a common practice for many svarim that published in those days, you would get a haskama, or several haskamas, but essentially what the haskamas were they were haramas. They were haskamas that says you have the right to publish the sefer, and nobody else has the right to publish the sefer for X amount of time, meaning depending on the amount of investment and depending on the scarcity of the sefer or the particulars of the intellectual property, the Bezdin or the Rav who was giving the Haskama would provide you a certain amount of window that you could sell it and nobody else could publish such a sefer. Now the Salavita Press, who were about to invest tremendous amounts of money into publishing a Shas, got a Haskama from none other than Ephraim Zalman Margolius, who at the time, in the early 1800s, was the brother Rav of sorts, from the Gedolei HaPoskim, a Gadol Hadar caliber Posik, and was not overtly Hasidish or Misnagdish, and therefore was widely accepted by all the different Kreiser. And they got a haskam from him saying that they could publish it, nobody else could publish it. Now, they did, and it was fabulously successful. They published it. They did a good job. They made high quality production, and the Salavita Shas sold out not once, not twice, 3 times. 3 editions of the Salavita Shas from this publishing sold out. Now, towards the late 1820s, it's many years later. It's still technically within the 25-year period that Ephraim Zalman Margolius said nobody else could publish the Shas for. But the Salavita Shas is fully sold out. They have no more of them on the market, and whatever they're going to do now is only going forward, trying to make a new edition of it. And the Matfisim in Vilna, Menachem Manis, I forgot his name, Menachem Manis Ram, who later on becomes, the press is known as Ha'almana Va'achem Ram, after Menachem Manis is Nifter, sets out to print their own Shas. Now, the halachic rationale that they have to allow them to violate the cherem, the haskama that exists on the Shas of Salavita is as follows, and that is the whole entire purpose of having a cherem on the Shas is to allow the investor, so to speak, to allow the machon or the printing house that invested, tremendous, damim v'damim, to be able to sell out their product and recoup their investment, and then only then should somebody else be able to get involved in the market. Now, the argument was, since Salavita already successfully sold out all copies of their Shas, and there are no more copies of their Shas on the market, it would hold to reason that Vilna should be able to publish a Shas now, and it should not be a problem. Now they got the haskam of tremendous Gedei Le'olam, including amongst them Reb Kiva Eger, Reb Shlomo Eger, the Chasim Sefer, Reb Avali of Vilna, Ram Avali of Vilna, and many of the other, Grace Gedei Le'olam and Paiskim of the Dar. In the short window that this fight existed for us, legend has it, and in the Sefer Ir Vilna, like History of Vilna, in the, I don't know, somewhere in the first 20, 30 pages, he brings a collection of many of the Paiskim that got involved. Supposedly upwards of 100 Rabbanim and Paiskim got involved. And although this was technically an extension of the Machlekes Misnagdim and Chasidim, although at that point in the late 1820s, 1830s, it had already settled down and there was not that much fighting going on, this was like a little bit of a throwback to real ancient Chasidim Misnagdim fight. But it wasn't really about that. It was really about Dinei Copyright and etc. Now, the reason why I mentioned this story as an introduction to the Sugi of Yarmulkas is because there's a terribly tragic post note to this story that I want to share. And that's as follows. In the heat of the moment, the Chassidim, meaning the Rav Shmuel Abba and Rav Pinchas, the 2 grandchildren of Pinchas Karitzer, spoke very negatively about Reb Kiva Eger. And Reb Kiva Eger, who was a gentle giant, a person who was not harsh on anybody, he was even reticent to ever call somebody his Talmud. If you're familiar with Reb Kiva Eger's Chuvas, he's a person who treats all comers with the utmost respect. In this very short letter that he wrote, is terribly wounded by the words and the actions of these Salavita printing brothers, and he says something extremely shocking and harsh, and because of that there's a very tragic ending to the story, and that's as follows. I'll just read you. He says, Ma'oid humali ala azaz shamatfisi Salavita v'divreim divrei Sarah lo levad al b'ni hagoyin niriyar shet levavi. Not only did they say about my son Reb Shlomo that he changed my mind, that he fooled me, ki hu yoser Sarah al sheyachelim lefates I lots of shlekedim. The bigger tie in what they said is that they said that I'm just like an old advocate person, and I was able to be fooled. And I was like, nothing that I say matters, he says. And Befrat, that in my letter I wrote clearly that I accepted all the edus, aside from both sides, aside from the Salavita side, aside from the Vilna side, and I'm being machriya on the Shaila based on my knowledge of it. And he ends off with this shocking line. He says, Eineni moichel lahem adavar klal uklal. I'm not moichel on this chutzpah, on this azus that they had not at all. Ki mitzidi eini makbid. From my own personal side, I'm not makbid. Avol bizayin hatayra leinitin limcha. On the bizayin hatayra, meaning the covered hatayra that's lost in this discussion, I'm not able to be moichel. And Kvega writes like a harsh statement. He says, I'm not moichel them, and there's nothing I can do to be moichel them. Now, sadly, not very long after that, the Russian government, in its general zeal to involve itself in any internal Jewish political issue, was involved already in this battle between the Matfisei Shas, and a short time later, a young assistant in the press was found hanged in the press, and the Russian government alleged that this boy was in possession of some contraband, some stuff that was going to be published without the knowledge of the censor, and had threatened to turn them over to the Russian government. And to avoid that happening, the brothers of Shmuel Abba and of Pinchas of Karetz had killed him, and the Russian government brought them on trial and sentenced them to an extremely harsh sentence. they would sentence these two brothers, to 1,500 lashes, and then after that, if they should survive, which was considered the less likely tzad, it was uncommon to survive, if they should survive, they'd be sentenced to Siberia. Now, Chassidish legend has it that now Stam, this is true. The way that they would get these lashes under the Russian government was they would walk through a gauntlet of many soldiers on each side, and each soldier would rain blows upon them until they got to the end of the gauntlet, and that was the end of the lashes, and then they would go to Siberia if they survived. Now, I don't remember which brother it is, either Shmuel Abba or Pinchas, but one of them, as he was walking down the gauntlet and being beaten, half to death, his yarmulke fell off his head. And he refused to move. He stayed rooted to the spot where he was, refusing to move until they placed the yarmulke back on his head. And we can only imagine how many extra, blows he received from this fateful decision, from his Mesiras Nefesh to not move without his yarmulke. Ultimately, they put it on. He continues, and both brothers survive brutal, miserable lives. They end up going to Siberia for over a decade each. One of them, I think, dies in Siberia. One of them is freed. It's a terribly tragic postscript to the story. But Al Kapanim, the interesting part of it to me is that you see this incredible Mesiras Nefesh that these brothers had when it came to wearing a yarmulke. And now we'll go through the sugya a little bit, and we'll see that according to many shittas in the Paiskim, it's only a minig, and then it's zichanat yahar val yaver, even if it's a halachic gemura, it's zichanat yahar val yaver. Nafal pikein, the fact is that a yarmulke became one of these things that's such an identity piece, such a consequential identity piece for a Jew, that it's sensible almost, so to speak, that a committed Jew would be holding by being Meiser Nefesh on this level if his yarmulke fell off. Now, I say this as an introduction. Now let's try to go into the sugya a little bit, the sources and the paiskim and etc., and also some of the cast of characters who may not have always been as black and white in regards to wearing a yarmulke as we're accustomed to thinking. And it will take us a few weeks, but in Mitzvah we'll get through all these various pratim. So now I want to start, before we get to the paiskim, to the halacha, I want to start with the chazals that are relevant to the shaila of yarmulkes. And the chazals are interestingly a very mixed bag, meaning it's far from clear from chazal, from the Gemaras, that it's a chiyuv gomer. Let's go through some of the Gemaras, and there's actually a very interesting brayso in Masechtas Kala, and then from there we'll move on to the Peiske Shared. So the proper starting places from the Gemara in Kedushin, the Flamed Aleph, from Aleph, the Gemara says as follows: Amar B'Shua ben Levi says, Asur la'adam she'ahalach arba amas b'kayim eskufa. A person's not allowed to walk 4 amas with an erect posture, a haughty posture. Shenemar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Shechina, fills up the world with Hashem's kavod, and when a person walks with a haughty posture, it looks like he's ignoring the fact that the Shechina is in the world. Rav Huna Brei Rishua, the Gemara brings following this, Lei Mazgi Arba Amas Begilei Rosh. He wouldn't walk 4 amas with his head uncovered. Amar Shechina L'mayla Miroshe. Says the Shechina is on top of my head. And interestingly, the Gemara in Shabbos and the Kufut Chesed Beis, when Rav Huna Bar Rishua, who's the same Adamar from over here in this Gemara, is talking about his accomplishments of life, it says Teisi li, the Hainu which Rashi is always mazmur, means I deserve some sort of extra schar. The Leisagidna Arba Amas Begilei Rosh. Leisagidna Arba Amas Begilei Rosh. I never walked 4 amas without Gilei Rosh. Now, Al Kapanim and many the Gedei Apaiskim make this diak, and we'll have to see how the Mechaber deals with this. Al Kapanim from Rabbi Huna Rabbi Shua, the way he says it in the Gemara in Kedushin, and even more so the way he says it tasily, that I deserve some sort of extra credit, some sort of extra schar, it sounds like Me'ikar Adin, this was not a chiyuv. One does not have to wear a yarmulke every time he walks 4 amas, but Rabbi Huna Rabbi Shua had this personal stringency, this personal chumrah that he made to be a central focal point of his Avodas HaChaim, and recognizing it as such, he says, tasily, I deserve some sort of special schar for this type of idea. Now we'll see the paiskim, each one will bring their rayas. There's a bach l'mashal in Archaim and Simon Beis and Sivkat and Hay that openly addresses this nakuda of teisili. The sprach of teisili sounds like it's extra. It doesn't say a lashon of iser. And then he makes the steer in diukim. He says like maski from the Gemara and Kedushin is more mashmayis of a chiyuv. But let's leave that all aside. I just want to note that the Gemara, the formative Gemara, the basic underlying premise of the entire start of the sugya, is a Gemara that talks about a personal anhaga teva of one Adam Eroim, and doesn't say it b'lashon chiyuv. Now, there is another Gemara, a very interesting Gemara. It's a shtickle b'kante Gemara. The Gemara in Shabbos and the Kufn Vav and Beis says as follows. It's a ganze meis. It says, Imid Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, the mother of Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Amri la Kaldai, the Kaldai who were Kishiv people who believe, were busy with sorcery. They were not Jews. Amri la kaldai brich ganvahu. Your son, who's going to be born or who was just born, is a ganif. Meaning, we see in the stars, we see his formulation. You know, when he was born and how he was born, that he's going to be a ganif. Make sure not to leave him with an uncovered head, which interestingly sounds like it was like a known wisdom, like accepted wisdom by everybody, that having a covered head contributes to your Shemayim. Amrulay, so she would tell him as a child, Kasi Reishach, cover your head, so you should have your Shemayim. Ubayi Rachmi, and Davin. So the Gemara says he, being a Vayli Ingel, he was a good boy. He learned, he davened, did everything right. He didn't know what's this ganze thing. I have to always wear yarmulkas. He's a good boy. He didn't understand what she wanted from him. It says Yom Echad one time, and this is mashma, he was already an adult. Yosef Kagaris Taisei Dikli. He was sitting and learning under a tree, under a dekel tree. Nafal Glima Meilui. His head covering fell off his head. Meilui Reisha Dali Ein Chazal Dikli. He looked up and he saw the dikla. Alima Yitzrei. He ate hard to steal the dates that were growing on this palm tree was so extreme. Salik Pascal Kibur Bashine. He climbed up the tree, and while clutching onto the tree, with his arms and legs, because you know what a palm tree looks like, to climb up it, he clutching onto it with his arms and his legs, he bit the dates off with his teeth. So desperate was he to steal it. Now he understood what his mother was saving him from by making him wear yarmulke all the time. Now, what's interesting, this is ironic, is that the Gemara in Saita, and Daf Beis, when it says Mishameis Rabbi Batlanov, it's a famous Gemara, it says Mishameis Rabbi Batlanov v'Yerescheit. So Amalei Rabbi Yosef Latana l'Sisli Anav Deka No. Amalei Rabbi Nachman Latana l'Sisli Yerescheit Deka No. Don't say Yerescheit, because there's still me. Now, in Rashi says that Rav Nachman over there is Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak Mechsidei Bavel. Now that's l'chayra the same Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak that the Gemara in Shabbos Daf Kuf and Vav Amud Beis is talking about. So interestingly is that he was so successful in inculcating Yiras Shamayim into his mahus by always wearing a yarmulke, by making sure that this, building block of Yiddish identity never left his head, that he was able to be say Leisisni Yiras Chet Tekano. I mean, he became the quintessential Yirei Chet, that even if the Rebbe was nifter, we were able to say Leisisni Yiras Chet Tekano. Stam, interestingly. But again, if we're analyzing the Gemara in a purely technical halachic manner, it seems pretty clear from the Gemara that not only is it not a chiyuv, it seems like wearing a yarmulke might only be something that's necessary if there's a particular set of nisyonis. If a person sees that he's, challenged with Yiras Shamayim, or a parent sees that his child is challenged with Yiras Shamayim, so he has to be machmer and medaktik that the child should always wear a yarmulke, or that the adult should always wear a yarmulke, to avoid, falling into this, to the nisayon that this particular person has. But it seems, again, to be far from conclusive that it's a chiyuv gomer for everybody at all times. Again, something the place can make the stick, and we'll see already, to be continued. We'll shake out exactly all these rayos are. Now, interestingly, is the Gemara in Kedushin Lamed Gimel Amud Aleph, literally 2 blot later, it says something interesting also. It says, Ravina Havayasav Kamei de Yirmiyah Midifti. Ravina was sitting in front of Yirmiyah Midifti. Chalafu Gaver Kamei v'le Michsi Reishek. Somebody passed by him and he wasn't covering his head. Amar Kama Chatzav Hai Gaver. What a mechutzav that guy is. Amalei Dilma B'Masa Mechasyaninu, the guy Siberabana. No, don't judge him unfavorably. Don't say that he's a mechutzav. Potentially, he lives in an area where it's commonplace to see gedolim, to see rabbis, and therefore he's not so taken by it, and he doesn't know how to behave. But be'etzem, he's not such a mechutzav. Stam, anecdotally, when my parents lived, when my father was a rav somewhere, there was a lot of, in Manhattan Beach, there was a lot of, totally irreligious Russians. They knew nothing, came from nothing, real true Tinakish and Ishbu. And there was a guy who lived on the corner of our block, a big bear of a guy. He was always outside in his front stoop smoking. 20, 30 times a day he was outside smoking. On Shabbos, when my father was walking to shul, we would walk to shul. If he saw my father coming, the cigarette went behind his back. It's fry as could be. This is a person who, I don't know if he came to shul even on Yom Kippur. He had no musig of what it meant to be Yiddish, to be Yiddish b'chal. When he saw a Rav coming, it's respectful to put the cigarette behind his back. So that's what the Gemara in Kedushin is saying. Kama chatzav hay gavra, that he doesn't even shtel zachzu if he sees a Talmud Chacham coming. In any case, but again, the Gemara sounds like Kama chatzav, that it's a gewisse sort chutzpah that he had, that he wasn't, wearing a yarmulke, but again, not a chiyuv gomer l'chayra, from this Gemara at face value. Now, and interestingly, aside from all these various diukim that we're making in the Gemara, like all these different nuances, a lot of these things will come back to be the exact rationales, meaning later on at a later shir we'll get to. There's about 9 or 10 different reasons for wearing a yarmulke that's gebracht in the Svarim and the Paiskim and etc. And a lot of them are based on tiny nuances in the Gemara Sprachs over here in these various Gemaras. So some of these diuke halashon that we're being aimed on now, just in regards to chiyev, minig, etc., will also be very relevant and pertinent to the discussion of the taimei, the tama minig or the tama chiv, but we'll leave that again for a later date. Now there is one more Gemara, and then I want to segue to a very interesting Chazal in general. There's another Gemara, the Gemara in Kedushin, Chavtas Amud Beis, says something. Now this one is not directly Yarmulka, this could be possibly something else, but it says as follows. It says, Mishtabeach le Rav Chisda le Rav Huna, b'der Rav Hamnuna, the Adam Gadol haya. It says, Rav Chisda used to constantly tell Rav Huna, that Rav Hamnuna is a great Adam Gadol. Amalei, he says, Kishiyavi liyadcha, when he comes to you, heavy liyad, they bring him to me. Kiyasa, when he came, Chazid le Parah Sudra. He saw that he wasn't wearing a yarmulke, he wasn't wearing a head covering. Amalei, my time le Parisa Sudra, why are you not covering your head? Amalei, lo nesivda, I'm not married. So Hadrana lapim, and he turned his face away from him. Amalei, Chazid le lehu la'apa yad nesivis. Don't see me until you're married. Now, it seems like over there that it was expected that since he was an Adam Gadol, he should be wearing a yarmulke. But he doesn't say, you're mechoyev, everybody's mechoyev. He says, as Ken Adam Gadol is a nish, don't come back to me until you're married. But this Gemara sounds like maybe it's more of a niche halacha that applies more to Talmidei Chachamim. Now there are some achronim that seem to learn that this Gemara is talking about ituf, not just kisei arosh, and again that's something we'll get to later, is that even b'mei Chazal, it seems like there was two different types of head coverings that could be engaged. There was a head covering like a yarmulke, which would be a simple cloth on top of a person's head that maybe possibly everybody could wear or should have worn or did wear, which we'll see. And then there's ituf harosh, which is something that maybe a Talmid Chacham did, which is another higher level, and maybe that's what Rav Hamnuna was munning. But al kapanim, all of these Gemaras, the two Gemaras in Kedushin, the Gemara in Shabbos, and I think there was a fourth Gemara, all of them seem to be relatively vague on establishing it as a chiv gomer versus being just a minig toiv or chumrah for Talmidei Chachamim or something to help with Yiras Shamayim or etc. Now there is another interesting source, early source that handles yarmulkes, and that's from the Masechta Brayso Masechtas Kala Rabasi in Parak Beis Halacha Beis. It says Pamachas hayuskenim yeshvim. There was some Chachamim who were sitting, and I believe it's Rabbi Akiva and it's Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Shua who were sitting. Avru lefneim shnei tinoikis, and I think according to some girses in the Masechtas Kala Rabasi, they were sitting on the stoop of the Beis Hamikdash, like right outside the Beis Hamikdash, and so two tinoikis passed by them. Echad galas reishay, echad kisas reishay. One of them was covering his head, and one of them was blazing cup, walking around with an open head. Zesha Gala Reisha, the one who was covering his head, Rabbi Eliezer says Mamzer, he's a Mamzer. Rabbi Shua says Ben Anida, he's a Nida, he's a child of a Nida. Not a Mamzer, not quite a Mamzer, but also of loose lineage. Rabbi Akiva says Mamzer Ben Anida, he's both. And the Gemara ends up telling us over there that the Chachamim challenged Rabbi Akiva to be able to back up, to explain where he got this from, how he knew this, and Rabbi Akiva, in a very clever manner, he goes and he tracks down the mother of this boy, and he convinces her by telling her that if she tells him the truth about this child, he'll be mevia la'ilam haba, he'll bring her to ilam haba, and she tells him the truth, that this boy is a Mamzer ben Hanida. And the Gemara tells us, the Brayso Kala Rabasi tells us that Rabbi Akiva kind of fooled her, because he never really said he's going to get ilam haba. He just says mevia la'ilam haba, I'll bring her to ilam haba, which I saw in a beer from Chaim Kanevsky. Chaim Kanevsky explains that he said, I'll get you an appointment that's like pull. I'll get you a hearing with the judge, but I can't tell you how it's going to work out. Meaning, I'll get you an interview in ilam haba, but if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But Yech Shia, the Gemara over there seems to be saying that just by looking at this child and seeing that his head was uncovered, that he wasn't wearing a yarmulke, that told all these Gedolei Atanam, Rav Elazar, Rabbi Shua, Rabbi Akiva, everything that they needed to know, that this is a child with suspect lineage. Now, Stam, incidentally, because we just on the calendar we just passed by the day of Tes Teves, so I'll just mention this. Kayidua, Ches, Tes, and Yud Teves are Tanesim. Those three are Tanis Sadikim. Now, if you look in the Shulchan Aruch and the Tanis, the Shulchan Aruch says Tes Teves, we don't know what the reason is. If you look in the piyut that we say in Asar B'Teves, it seems like the reason is because of Misas Ezra Sefer. There are others that say because it's the Misa of Rabbi Yosef Hanagid, and there's a whole handful of different reasons that are given. But the Shulchan Aruch, the Mechaber, and he's really quoting from a Torah, and I think it's a Bahag, seems to say that we don't know the reason for this day. Now, there are those, and I've spoken about this at some point in the past, that say that the real true day of Nittel, the day that Yeshu was born, is the day of Ches Teves, and that's why it's a Tainus. And the true Nittel is Tes Teves. And the reason why the Mechaber and the Bahag and other Rishonim chose to neglect this and to leave this out was Machmas HaSenzura. They were afraid of being in trouble, and they didn't want to write this explicitly. Now, where does this come from? So there's a Sefer called Sefer Toldos Yeshu HaNotzri, in its various editions. There's many, many versions of it, exactly when it was written, when it was not written. We've talked about this in the past. There was a conference in Princeton University. They published a whole book about it. It's a whole sugya where and what and all the details. But back in the day, at some point, in some kehillas, there was a minhag to read it at certain times in the year. be it as it may, whatever it is, there is a version of the Sefer Toldos Yeshua Nittel that says that this child, who the Masechtas Kala talks about, who was bareheaded, b'mailas harabayas, and was observed by the Chachamim, and Rabbi Akiva later tracked down his lineage, his matrimonial lineage, and found out that he's a Mamzer ben Anida, was none other than Yeshua Noitzri and his illustrious mother, Miriam Azayna. Now, being if that's so, and there's a version that says that, so then it just ups the stakes even further, is that you see the great risk, so to speak, and the great potential for damage that exists by someone who doesn't adhere to the minig to cover his head properly. Now, b'chalev and shia, this is the basic, call it, groundwork of the sugis that are relevant to discuss the shaila. Now, there's many shitas in the Paiskim. We have to see the Mechaber, the Goyin has a famous sheet about this. Is a famous shuvah from the Marshal, the Trumas Hadeshen, and etc. And I think over the next few weeks we'll go through some of the Paiskim. We'll talk about some of the interesting characters who may be exceptions to this rule, who didn't always wear yarmulkas, and what their position and take on the matter was. And then at the end of it, we'll try to go through some of the various taimim that are given, say in the halacha, say in Kabbalah, and stam and Ramazim, etc. For the minig, for the strong adherence to wearing yarmulke. Now, additionally, there's a whole set of shilas about when it's permitted to take off your yarmulke. And, in particular in America in the early days, that was a very, very common thing. And Ramosha has several famous shuvas about it. And Mir Hashem, over the next couple of weeks, we'll get to these. We'll go down some of these rabbit holes, and we'll see. Maybe perhaps we'll even continue on to Yiddish and Lashon Kodesh and Levusha Yehudi and maybe some more of these things, all the Jewish identity markers. Anyhow, to be continued. Yeshua.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.